Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Nightmare Press podcast. Today, we are speaking with, I am speaking with L. Andrew Cooper. He is one of Nightmare Press's authors, and he has also many other things going on. And we will let him talk about that. But we will first start with the basic question. Andrew, tell us a little bit about how you got into writing.
Well, I could start that story at a number of different places in my life, but the easiest answer is that I've always written since I learned how. I started writing stories probably first or second grade, little adventures. Actually, I tried writing choose your adventure novels back when I was reading those in the second and third grade, and didn't do such a good job with that. But my sort of breakout moment, I think, was in the third grade when I wrote a ghost story and read it to my class. And the next day, a girl in my class told me it gave her nightmares, and I was like, "Yes, I won! I did something that really changed somebody's life." And then from then, I was hooked. I just thought, I'm going to keep doing these things and seeing if I can have effects on people. So that's when I got into it. Didn't start publishing until much later. I spent 10 years in college and grad school and was focused on nonfiction and criticism, and then started publishing fiction after that.
Well, that sounds like quite a bit of a journey there. Do any of your early stories still kind of show up in your current works, like those stories you wrote as a kid? Do any elements of that ever find themselves into some of your more modern fiction?
Yes. There are certain themes that I've been obsessed with in my entire life that I keep coming back to. And again, the story I just referred to that I wrote in the third grade was a sort of classic Gothic style ghost story, and I wrote a screenplay a few years ago that was definitely in that mode and made me think about that story from my childhood. And I always had a flair for shock, and I still write some pretty shocking stuff. So that hasn't stopped. Though I've gotten much more shocking as I've gotten older.
Yeah, that tends to happen. I guess you experience more, see more, and come to start to think of what would be more shocking. I think the older you get, the more you deal with what's shocking. What shocks you when you're young, as you grow older, it takes more to shock you. You become more desensitized. So then you start thinking of more outlandish events, I think. Um, so you just released a novel through Nightmare Press, Noir Falling, a bizarre mystery of art and the mind. One of the things I liked about it is that it takes the press in a direction of some more surrealist work, which I'd like to see more of. So tell us about that book.
Well, Noir Falling is, as you said, a if it's any one thing, I think surrealist is the word for it. I wouldn't use a capital S because it's not historically surrealist as in the movement from the 1920s, but it definitely goes for surreal effects in that it's distorted. The things that happen are mind bending, and the imagery is as the title suggests, bizarre. It sort of starts in a kind of realistic place, but goes off the rails by the end of the first chapter and never gets back on the rails since. The storyline, once it gets going, is sort of based on noir or hard-boiled detective fiction, and the main character gets told he's a detective, and he meets this woman who is sort of fits the classic femme fatale profile, and she tells him that her husband, who is a corporate magnate, is keeping her prisoner, and he must come to, and the main character Daniel must come to her rescue. And so slowly Daniel starts taking on the identity of a detective and following clues and searching for her. But his journey is not typical noir, not typical detective story. It's a combination of noir with fantasy and a little bit of horror and other genres. But again, the constant is surrealism, because Daniel's experiences are mind blowing.
It's certainly a very experimental piece. You played around with like some language and writing techniques in that book too. What sort of like what influenced you to write such a thing and like to experiment with, your own style of writing?
Well, I have spent a large portion of my life studying literature, so I've read a great deal, and I've always had a strong interest in literature from the early 20th century. So from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, when surrealism was a new phenomenon, when modernism was basically tearing the novel to pieces and working with stream of consciousness, working with characters who don't follow the typical David Copperfield Dickens kind of mode of, I was born, I grew up, I lived a life, I met these people, I found love, and so on. And so I in the spirit of that kind of writing, I very much enjoyed tearing typical narrative to tiny little pieces. Daniel in Noir Falling doesn't so much go from point A to point B to point C in a logical manner, but kind of wakes up at point A or wakes up at point D or wakes up at point Z and doesn't really know how he got there from one moment to the next, and kind of has to figure out how he gets places and who he is while he's figuring out this mystery that kind of just gets thrown on top of him. And that results in some writing that can feel disjointed, but I hope it's also a lot of fun, because the ride that Daniel takes is a wild ride, and I think the style of the writing mimics his experience, and so readers get to go along with him because of that.
Yeah, there's certainly a, I don't know if I want to call it a market, but there's certainly a corner in literature that is for experimental types of works, and I feel like it would be nice to see more of that out there. It's almost like people have started to forget. Like people will write like Bizarro, but it's not really the same thing, and um, that's more transgressive fiction, which I like too. But I think some people have kind of gotten tired of. So at some point, I think somewhere along the way, people developed this sort of attitude towards experimental fiction. I read an article once. It was about the type of authors someone didn't like, and one of the things in there was people who say they're going to destroy narrative, and the reason behind that was that they feel like people who write who say that or write these kind of experimental pieces lack the ability to write a linear narrative, and I just don't agree with that. I think that would be someone who possibly doesn't understand experimental literature, or maybe they're just used to people who tried it and didn't know how to do it. But I think I just don't agree with that. What would you say to that sort of criticism?
Yeah, I think if and this is something that is relevant to Noir Falling, because Noir Falling has a lot to say about painting as well. Before Picasso pioneered Cubism, he learned how to paint traditional images. I don't think you can be a good experimental writer unless you know what you're experimenting with, unless you have mastered the tools or mastery, I guess, is egotistical, but unless you know how to use the tools of traditional narrative, you can't break them. At least you can't break them and use them well.
Right. Yeah.
And use broken tools well. So I've written plenty of traditional narratives, or more traditional narratives than NOIR Falling. NOIR Falling is the most far out novel I've ever written. And I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of traditional narratives. And so I think that having a feel for and a love for traditional narratives it was absolutely necessary for me to start prying them apart and twisting them and creating something I think is pretty different in NOIR Falling. And I think that if people can't write traditional narratives, I hope they will stay away from experimenting, because they're probably just producing crap.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, like you said, knowing at least understanding how to write a traditional narrative. And I think, like you said, most people who successfully write or execute such a thing usually have the ability to write traditional narrative. And,
well, to take for example, one of my favorite writers of all time is Virginia Woolf. And if you look at her first couple of books, they're not my favorites. They're pretty standard novels. And then you look at the turn she takes and look at brilliant, experimental works like Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse, or my personal favorite, The Waves, and you can see how she developed and how she took her earlier style and created something completely different and formally adventurous from it. She's one of my heroes for having done that and created so much new that was possible in novelistic form.
Yeah, couldn't the same be said for Burroughs? Some of his earlier stuff was pretty traditional, wasn't it? If I remember correctly.
I have not read his earlier stuff. I mean, I've read Naked Lunch, but I'm not familiar enough to.
Yeah, he definitely did. He definitely did some interesting. That's the same thing with Joyce. I don't know much about his earlier stuff, but I know he wrote some very experimental. I don't know if I'm sure he wrote traditional narratives, but I know Ulysses is his big one. So
yeah, a lot of people read The Dubliners, his first book, the collection of short stories, because The Dubliners is very accessible. And Portrait of the Artist, has some experimental bits, but it's still a pretty readable novel. And he kind of goes off the deep end with Ulysses, and even further off the deep end in Finnegan's Wake, which I haven't read. But yeah, he worked his way into creating what some people think is the greatest novel of the 20th century, Ulysses. I don't agree with that, but I think it's an important book because it does so much that people hadn't seen before.
Yeah. I just actually, for a long time, I'd been looking for a decent copy of Ulysses, and I could never find one unless it was super expensive, like at the bookstore. And but I would find them like used ones, and they'd be like all marked up with like academic notes and all that. And so I finally found one pretty good. I look forward to reading that. And Finnegan's Wake, I hear that one's quite an adventure. But so tell us about some of your background in, and you said you have background in literature, like in education. What's a little bit about that? Do you think what's your background, and what has helped you, get to where you are today with your writing?
Well, first of all, I'd like to, preface this by saying, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, going to public school, so this wasn't handed to me. But I did major in English at Harvard, and then I went on to Princeton for my PhD in English literature. And I was so into literature in college, I spent all of my electives taking more literature classes. So I spent 10 years in college and grad school reading everything I could get my hands on, which was a lot. And the fancy schools weren't easy. I took a lot of classes and read a lot of books because of the classes that I took, and then kept reading outside of that too. And of course had to write a lot in response to that. And even though I didn't pursue creative writing as a major, I convinced my professors from time to time to let me write stories instead of final papers, and they were supportive. So that gave me a pretty strong background in literature. And then I went on to do some teaching, and I taught a lot of composition, not creative writing, but I taught a lot of writing, which made me a pretty good editor, and strengthened my toolbox again, the skills I have for communicating thoughts through the written word. I started teaching at Princeton, and then went to Georgia Tech, and I taught at other places as well. So my entire, I'm no longer teaching now. I'm just focusing on writing and some other things. But my entire life has been devoted to reading and writing in some form or other.
Yep, and I guess I'm going to talk about your blog where you do interviews, and I'm going to tie that in because you ask incredible questions. I've read through your blog before, and you get really to the heart of someone's work and really push them to figure out why they wrote or what it really means to them. So do you feel like that, obviously that ability that you learned through your education made it to where you know the right questions to ask? And do you like how do you like about that? Do you ever feel like you learn something from these interviews, or what in what way do they fulfill you, like in your writing course?
Oh, absolutely. I learned a huge amount through my interviews, which is why I spend a lot of time on them, or the main reason I spend a lot of time on them. Yeah, I try to do one a week. I don't always succeed. Last year, 2024, I did 35 interviews out of the 52 weeks of the year, all with different authors, and authors or filmmakers. And I do use, when I try to read the material they send me, and I come at it like I would have come at a book that I was going to bring into the classroom and teach, and that I ask critical questions as I'm reading. I highlight, I make notes, and then I turn those into questions that I send to the author, and the author sends back answers, and that's how I'm keeping up with particularly the horror genre, which is one of my main genres, not my only genre. That's how I feel in touch with what's happening in the world, particularly the world of indie presses. And not NOIR Falling, but another book I've got coming out in less than a week now. I don't think I would have written had I not interviewed so many writers who are producing transgressive fiction. I was very much inspired by them, what I learned from them in their interviews. So it's a way to be connected. It's a way to learn. It's a way to share energy with so many people who are doing such fantastic work that is not in the mainstream.
So okay, so I was going to bring up you're talking about Alex Escape, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that of course is coming out in a week, and it's interesting. So was this your first shot at the more transgressive fiction that you found, you were reading during your interviews?
It's my first self-conscious shot at extreme horror and or splatterpunk. I've written extreme stuff before, but I wasn't really aware of extreme horror as a subgenre, and I wasn't aware of splatterpunk, even though I had an anthology of splatterpunk on my shelves, and I've had it since grad school. But I wasn't really aware until I started interviewing people and reading widely in that subgenre, and just getting a real feel for the strategies people are using to cross boundaries, and being really gross and disgusting, but also making political points and getting other ideas across, not just while being shocking, but by being shocking.
Yeah.
And like I said before, that really inspired me, and so again, I've done extreme stuff before, stuff that retroactively I might call splatterpunk, but this was my first concerted effort to go really, really, really far with horror.
Yeah, that's splatterpunk almost seems to me like the term itself is kind of like an insider term, or at least not so much like, because obviously people who read it are aware of it, but it's like I didn't know about that term until, I don't know, maybe 2017, 2018, when I started dealing with indie authors. And I feel like before I had always written stuff that had been kind of graphic, kind of extreme, and I wasn't even aware that that kind of market existed. Like, I wasn't real, I didn't know a lot. So it was pretty interesting to see all the amount of extreme horror out there. And I know they differentiate between extreme horror and splatterpunk, but to see a lot of it, and some of it is very good. Who are some of the What were some of the works that you found to be most, I don't know, influential to Alex's escape, like when you were doing your interviews?
Well, I sort of started down the splatterpunk road, reading Monica J. O'Rourke and Rath James White, and both of whom are just incredibly talented. And Rath James White's The Resurrectionist really, really grabbed my imagination. A lot of splatterpunk sort of refuses the supernatural in its horrors, but there's a supernatural core in The Resurrectionist, and Alex's Escape has a supernatural core that creates the occasions for the extreme violence. Incidentally, I wrote a blog post recently where I talk about the debates about the difference between extreme horror and splatterpunk, and I created a graphic where there's a Venn diagram where it's like, okay, you got extreme horror and you got splatterpunk, and they kind of intersect, and so there's a lot of overlap there. So I think Alex's Escape is both. I don't know if people would approve of that Venn diagram, but that's how I think of it. But so yeah, Rath James White, The Resurrectionist. One of the people kind enough to blurb Alex's Escape, Jonathan Butcher. He wrote a book that's called a novella called Your Loved Ones Will Die First. That Ryan Harding and Megan Stockton and Stuart Bray all contributed violent set pieces to. And they all inspired me a lot in the way that both Jonathan Butcher's frame for the violent scenes created a great story, but also the way that the violent scenes worked in conjunction with that frame story. That whole setup helped me to outline Alex's Escape and figure out how to work moments of extreme violence into a larger narrative structure. So those two books were both very influential. But I could go on just because I've interviewed so many different splatterpunk / extreme horror writers, and they've all added their spice to my sauce.
Yeah, it's interesting because you would think, I don't know, I feel like you would think that the splatterpunk and extreme horror subgenres would have a little more mainstream notice. Like, they're real big in their communities, but like, I don't know, I guess it's kind of like the movies, because like a lot of the movies, there's always been those gore style movies, particularly like a lot of the Italian, like the Giallo or Giallo, however you pronounce it, and especially like Fulci and Argento. but I guess they also kind of have their cult thing. So it's kind of like the splatterpunk and extreme horror community. It almost seems like they'd be better off if they didn't find like a huge mainstream audience, because there's more room for that artistic and no boundaries creation. And I know some have wondered why, kind of lamented that there's not more room for it, but the community is very supportive of itself. So how do you feel about, do you feel like that cult status that they kind of stay within themselves help creatively, or does it create boundaries, do you think?
I think probably a little bit of both, but I think it's more helpful than anything else, in that I have felt a sense of support as a newcomer to the community, and I have felt encouragement to explore. And knowing that there's this community out there gives me hope that I can find readers. I mean, there's no way that Alex's Escape could ever be mainstream. It's just too far out there. So I don't really have any secret dreams of mainstream success with this book. It's just never going to happen. But I do have hopes that the community will accept it. I mean, the book goes too far, I think, probably for some people in the splatterpunk community, to be honest. But I still have hopes that it will be accepted by the community. And if there weren't such a community out there, I couldn't even hope for that. So I think it's good that it's there.
Well, it's certainly popular. I mean, there's a lot of authors who do that, and they find a large readership online, and they are a very supportive community of one another in a lot of ways. So I think you probably have a pretty good shot. I don't see why you wouldn't. You're a very talented author. So I enjoyed Noir Falling very much, obviously, or I wouldn't have signed it. And I hope that you do find a good foothold there. So that kind of leads me to Horrific Scribblings, your new publishing imprint. So so you're starting out. How's that going to start out, and where do you see yourself going forward with that over time?
Well, Horrific Scribblings, I officially brought into existence in November, and Alex's Escape will be its first official publication. I mean, I guess technically I've published some short stories on the Horrific Scribblings website, so those already exist as Horrific Scribblings publications. But really, we meaning I in the plural, are starting with Alex's Escape. And I've got this three phase outline on the website for what I'm doing with Horrific Scribblings. At first, it's basically about me. I'm publishing Alex's Escape, and then I'm publishing the 4 volumes of my epic, The Middle Reaches, which I originally published on Kindle Vella, which is no longer going to exist after this month. But altogether, it's about 1,000 pages long. And as I said in a Facebook post, since my name isn't Stephen King, I'm not going to try to publish it as a single book. I'm bringing it out as 4 short or longish novellas. And then I've got another novella that will be ready to go. And if we, meaning I, do well enough and make at least some money, I will probably turn to some crowdfunding so that I can go to phase 2, which is to put out some anthologies. And I want those anthologies to be pro markets, which is why I would need to do some crowdfunding, because I'm not rich. I want to pay pro rates and put together some horrific anthologies, at least 1 or 2 under the Horrific Scribblings label, to broaden our an author base, or to create an author base associated with the label, and to get the name out there more, so it's not just the L. Andrew Cooper label. And then, assuming that works out, go to phase 3 and start signing people to the label. so that it can become more of a robust press. So that's the grand design. How long this is going to take? A year, 2 years is kind of what I'm imagining. Just to build up enough of a base to make sure that if once I am signing people, I can make them successful, at least as successful as indie presses can be. And so that's the outlook.
Yeah, it's an ever changing it's an ever changing industry with the indie presses. I know so much has changed since we started Nightmare Press back in, I think it was 2018. I want to say. Of course, we had to take a hiatus for a bit, but yeah, I kind of started the same way. I kind of started it just because I didn't really want to deal with like publishers, agents, and stuff for Night of the Possum. So I just kind of did it myself, despite having some interest, people having interest in it. And then it kind of was just like other people are kind of like, well, you ought to publish, these people. Or you ought to publish other people. You have a lot to offer. And then we kind of went away for a couple of years, and then when we came back, like all the platforms that I built, all the network I built, so much had changed and it was gone. So you have to really stay like on top of things with the indie world. I would imagine it's probably the same, up top, but we don't know about that, so we just know on the ground floor, I guess. But
yeah, and going back to Noir Falling, I mean, I do want to create a kind of brand for Horrific Scribblings, and it's in the name. I do want Horrific Scribblings to be a horror brand, and so I'm publishing my horror stuff through it. And then when I do anthologies, they will be horror themed anthologies, and we'll want to sign horror writers eventually. And my sort of catchphrase is provocative, scary, and strange. So while I don't want to just do splatterpunk or extreme horror, I will be looking for horror that is transgressive, boundary pushing, generally weird, unusual. But my book Noir Falling that you're publishing wouldn't be appropriate for Horrific Scribblings, which is why I'm so glad that you were nice enough to take it on, because like I said, there are horrific elements in it, but it is experimental, it is surreal, it's got mystery, it's got other genre elements. And so I think it's much more appropriate for you than it is for the press that I've just started. And I think that while we were talking about the audience and the community for Alex's Escape, I think with the diversity of stuff Nightmare Press does, Nightmare Press is going to have a much better time. At least this is my hope, and I think I'm on board with that. Finding the community for an oddball like Noir Falling, because it's intellectual, it's philosophical, it's way off the beaten path, and there is an audience for that, but it's not as ready-made as an audience for horror, which has so many defined subgenres that have built-in audiences. And so I think the right people are going to have a lot of fun with Noir Falling. And so you and I are going to find those right people.
Yes, we are. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like when we came back, right? That was my goal. Like even before, I had a goal to want to push Nightmare Press beyond just horror. And with so many extreme horror and splatterpunk imprints having been out there at the time, I didn't really want to take that on, because it was kind of like, well, I don't want to. That's already out there. I want to do something different, because I knew there was a lot of other authors who were looking. And now that I think splatterpunk has grown more since then, I think Horrific Scribblings is probably coming along right at a really good time. But with like some of the other books we picked up, like American Mystic, The Life, Death, and Rebirth of Jimmy Wonderful, is kind of a strange low fantasy type thing. And then there's others like that bend more towards a sci-fi. So when I got like Noir Falling, when you sent that in, I was reading your synopsis and reading through it, I was like, well, this is definitely something that I want. So yeah, I have the same hope you do that we'll find the audience. I think we are slowly growing an audience, because I guess it kind of on the indie level starts with the authors, right? It starts with the authors and the publishers themselves finding the people, and then it all kind of rises from there. And that's where I'm hoping to go. and hopefully it encourages more experimental authors like yourself to say, hey, there's a place for this, and hopefully someone else will be like, oh look, Nightmare Press did this, we're going to try and do it now. So that would be really cool if other people wanted to do that. So it all could start with you and me.
All right.
And so tell us, you've talked about Alex's Escape, you talked about Noir Falling, and the big novel you have. What are some other novels you've written? Are those the only ones you have out, or?
No, I've got a few others out. Most relevant to Noir Falling is my novel Crazy Time, which is subtitled A Bizarre Battle with Darkness and the Divine. The subtitles are intentionally parallel. Crazy Time, a bizarre battle with darkness and the divine. Noir Falling, a bizarre mystery of art and the mind. They're kind of companion pieces. Crazy Time is a horror novel. Noir Falling is not a horror novel. But Crazy Time is written with a similar experimental kind of prose and is also extremely surreal, but it's much more horrific. It's about a woman who goes through what seems like an unstoppable series of traumatic events, to the point where she begins to believe she is cursed, like in the book of Job. And she is an agnostic. She doesn't take that idea very well. And so she talks to a lot of different people, psychics, Satanists, and basically starts with a vendetta against God. And a lot of very, very strange and horrific situations spin out of that. So that is one of my novels that has been among the best received. Most of my stuff is pretty divisive. It is not a religious novel, despite the fact that there's the divine in the title. The divine plays a part, but if you're looking for religious affirmation, it is not the book for you. So there's that one. I took a long hiatus from publication, but other novels I've published, back in 2014, I published a horror novel called Descending Lines, with a press that no longer exists, also in a Kentucky-based press. It was called Blackworm Publishing. And that novel is about a young couple whose daughter is dying of cancer, and they have the fortune or misfortune of knowing a ritual that will save her life. It just requires having and sacrificing another child, which they decide they're going to do. And the novel follows through the pregnancy and whether or not they can follow through with their decision. And that one, I'd say, is what I was thinking about when I say looking back. That one's kind of splatterpunk because it gets really nasty. So there's that one. The one before that was called Burning the Middle Ground, which was sort of way too forward-looking politically, in the way it looks at a small town that is divided by a tragedy along political lines. And I won't say more than that. And there are a few more books out there in addition to some nonfiction from my academic days. My first published book was called Gothic Realities, and it covers about 300 years of horror. My second was a study of Dario Argento, whom you mentioned before. I'm a big Argento fan, also a big fan of Fulci and Italian horror and the Giallo in general. So that's a sample of my book list.
Awesome. Yeah, because I would be interested to know so there's the debate, like, right, where horror really began, horror literature. Where would you say it began?
I am fairly traditional in that I trace modern horror back to the Gothic novels of the 18th century. The first so-called Gothic story was Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, published 1764. And that set off a wave of imitators, and the sort of crest of popularity for the original Gothic novels was in the 1790s. A lot of people associate that with the French Revolution. This was a British phenomenon, but it was influenced by the Revolution across the Channel. The two big figures from that would be Matthew Lewis and Anne Radcliffe. Matthew Lewis is known for the Monk, which is sort of the beginning of splatter horror, and Radcliffe known more for suspense and atmosphere and apparently supernatural events that get explained somehow as having been realistic all along by the end. This leading to different traditions in horror. So that's usually where I go for the origin. Of course, you can find horrific elements in much earlier fiction. A lot of people point to John Webster and his plays in the Renaissance period. You can find gruesome moments in some medieval literature. And some of the drama, even Chaucer has his moments, but really the 18th century is the starting point for what became modern horror.
Yeah, I kind of think along the same lines you do. The Gothic literature is, I feel like, where it really began. So in some of your writing, you said it was divisive to a lot of people. I feel like, I don't know. I feel like if you're writing, unless of course, obviously, if you're writing for the market and you're writing, the formulas, like a lot of people who try to get on the bigger publishers do. I feel like if you're trying to write more experimental or different literature, I think divisive is a good thing. I mean, of course, everybody wants everybody to like. Of course, a lot of people want almost everybody to like their work, but I feel like if they're divided on the content and the topics and the themes, then it could show that you're really doing something different or something unique to push boundaries. How would you feel about that?
Yeah, I believe in that. Otherwise, I might be more formulaic and make more money.
I'm right there with you.
But yeah, if an idea that pops into my head isn't unconventional in some way, it's not likely to pass what I refer to as the Darwin test in my brain. I'm likely to forget about it. I'm not likely to keep mulling it over long enough for it actually to get written, just because it's going to bore me.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I'll have ideas and I'll be like, well, this could be good that a lot of people would like, and then I'm just like, I could write that, but I might get bored. And that's probably why I have like 6 or 7 works open right now, because but yeah, I'm like you. I get the unconventional idea that just seems really good, because that's the stuff I like, right? Like, especially with like films, but in books too, because I've been discovering more of those unconventional books. So yeah, I feel like you do. If it's not different, it's just not going to hold my interest as far as writing. Reading's different, but so I would assume that you feel like with the divisive nature of your work and the reactions, you feel like you probably hit the nail that you were aiming for, right?
Usually, sometimes I get reactions that make me go, huh? But mostly, I mean, I haven't gotten many reactions to Noir Falling yet, but I assume that reactions will be similar to reactions I got to Crazy Time, whereas some people are gonna like the style, and some people are gonna say, hey, there are a lot of big words and long sentences here, and I don't like that. And that's one kind of divisive. Another kind of divisive is that Noir Falling makes you think. It's got a lot of big ideas, and I told my early readers that you don't have to understand every concept I throw at you. You just keep reading and try to have fun with it. But not everyone's going to be comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's true.
And so that's another kind of divisiveness for that book. For Alex's Escape, of course. The divisiveness I expect is, well, there's this extreme violence and there are other taboos that I break. Some people are going to go for that, and some people are going to say, oh my gosh, what a horrible person this writer must be to have come up with such horrific filth.
Yeah.
And I'm ready for that. Something I didn't quite expect, that I'm already getting from reactions to Alex's Escape, is that the book kind of has a slow twist of an ending. And some people are just raving about how great the ending is, and some people are absolutely hating it. So it's divisive on that front as well. And I knew the ending was going to be surprising to people, but I didn't know it was going to be quite so divisive. But hey, I'm okay with that. People who know they're going into Splatterpunk and are surprised that there's shocking violence, that's one of the reactions.
Yeah, I don't get that. It's like, okay, like, I don't know. Like I said, again, some people don't know that term, but I don't know. I feel like by now it's getting to a point where the people who even that those books get on their radar should know what the term means, because it's not like you're just going to walk into Walmart or Barnes and Noble and be like, oh, hey, look, look, it's a Splatterpunk book. No, they don't have that stuff sitting around. So it's not like it's fallen into the hands of people who don't know what's going on, right? So the people who find these books, they already are well aware of Splatterpunk. So it is kind of weird to me too that you see people who are like, oh, the content of this book just offended me because it was so gross, and it's just like, you were reading extreme horror. What the hell do you expect is going to happen? So I don't know. It's strange to me. So, all right. So earlier we talked about Fulci. Fulci said something really interesting once, and I can't remember it, word for word, but he something to the effect of like his films were more like just a series of pictures, kind of, I guess, kind of like a phantasmagoria type thing of images, and I think that's really interesting. Have you ever like thought of like approaching a book that way? Because I certainly have.
Yeah, and I think that's harder to do with prose than it is with film, obviously. But I've written short fiction that I think I might describe that way, where the narrative is or story is so slight or irrational that mostly it's about immersing yourself in a series of bizarre images. I don't know if I could sustain that for an entire novel or something as long as a novel.
It would be very difficult, I think, but it's something to be interesting to try, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be interesting. And like going back to Burroughs, I mean, thinking about my experience reading Naked Lunch, that comes pretty close. So I think there are writers who have experimented in those directions. But yeah, I'm not sure I could sustain it for an entire novel, but it's definitely something I've experimented with in short fiction and would likely experiment with again.
Be interesting. So, a lot of people say write what you know, and then others say don't do a self-insert. But I think personal influences are important to a lot of people's work. Do you have like with Noir Falling or whatever, any kind of like little bits and pieces of your own life or your own outlook put into those books that kind of expand the story?
Yes. Noir Falling in particular is a collection of intellectual obsessions. It's. I mean, I can't just list all of the different things that are
Yeah,
in
don't
the
do
book,
that. You don't want to give away your book. So
but yeah, it's about identity. It's about behaviorism, consciousness, agency, all kinds
essentially,
of juicy
things you thought about.
things about reality
Mhm.
and how do you know what's real, and does that concept even make any sense in the end? And it's about mental illness. It's about all kinds of different things that I'm passionate about, and I just crammed them into a few hundred pages. And so there's a lot of what goes on in here ended up on the pages of Noir Falling. And there's also a little bit of autobiography in it, in that it's I never say this, but it is set in Boston and Cambridge, where I went to college, and the main character is loosely based, or no, I won't even say based, inspired by someone I knew. Um, and I won't say more about that because I haven't been in touch with that person in more than 25 years. But
Plus, you don't want to give away, you don't want to give away all the secrets of your book, but it's it's just I think I asked that question though, and I tend to ask it mostly authors who come on the show, because there's always that debate, don't write yourself into books versus write what you know. And I get there's a lot to unpack with either of those statements, but obviously we're not going to go into every little detail every time we talk about that, answer that question. But I do think, it's a little bit of both, but I do think it's quite important that people have a grasp on what they're writing about. And I think personal observations, and it doesn't have to be what happened to you. You could have seen it happen to this guy over here that you've been working with for 100 years, So I don't know. I think, what would you say to someone who asks you that debate? Should you just keep writing what you know and avoid putting yourself in, or you should put yourself in? Obviously, I know what your answer would be, but explain why you think it's important that they reach into their own experiences.
well, there's always some speculation and guesswork involved in writing, at least the sort of writing I do, because I do a lot of fantastic stuff. I mean, I don't write high fantasy, but there's a lot of dark fantasy in Noir Falling, and so there's a lot of stuff that I just made up. But even when writing fantasy, you've got to ground it somehow. You've got to have some place where your feet feel like they're on the ground, and often the best way to do that is to write about grounds that you know well, and that's where writing what you know comes in. If you're not familiar with something, you're not very likely to describe it in a way that people can relate to. And so you've got to have that at least an in of relatability. And at least 9 times out of 10, the best way to create that is to use something familiar to you as a writer.
Yeah.
And so I believe in that, even though I write off the wall crap. There's still a tiny way in from actual experience.
Yeah, and I've also noticed, of course, other people say, well, if you want to write about it and you don't know about it, research it. And I think that's obviously not a bad idea, but a lot of the times you can tell in someone's work where they just recently researched this stuff for their book, because it'll be almost like reading a manual on it. And I've noticed that in like, certain works, people that over describe things. And I think that's part of like, I don't know. I think it's a tricky slope. Like you got to stick, like you said, to grounding what you know. And I think that's an interesting perspective. So we're almost out of time. So I'll go ahead. This is the opportunity I give to talk about what's coming next. And we've covered everything there is to plug. But what do you, other than, anything else you didn't talk about that you're working on or something, you got planned?
Well, like I said, I've got Alex's Escape coming up. After that, the four slim volumes that add up to the big tome of the Middle Reaches. Then after that, there'll be a novella called Father is Pleased, and I'm currently working on another novella called The Skinner Effect. And there is a pun, but the title actually refers to B.F. Skinner. But that one's going to be pretty nasty too, or so far it is anyway. So I've got a lot cooking and a lot in the pipe coming down, and I've actually got another title I might pitch to you, but we're going to wait a little while on that.
Okay.
But yeah, so I hope people will take an interest and pay attention to what I've got coming, because 2025 is a busy year for me.
Yep. So where would they find this? Where could they keep up with your work?
Well, I've got two main websites. There's my personal website, landrewcooper.com, and then there's my publishing imprints website, horrificscribblings.com.
All right, great. And of course, if you all want to pick up a copy of NOIR Falling, that you can find on Amazon through Nightmare Press, we're actually going to redo our website. Our current website is down, but we're going to redo, kind of in a transitional. I didn't like the way the old one was, so I'm going to find something better. But other than that, our stuff is going to be available on the Nightmare Press blog very soon. So, but NOIR Falling, A Bizarre Mystery of Art and the Mind, check it out. Check out Horrific Scribblings. Keep an eye on that. Thank you, L. Andrew Cooper, for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much, Jacob.